This is NC Spin, an unrehearsed discussion on issues of interest to North Carolinians. Now, here is your moderator, Tom Campbell.
Welcome. You've heard and read the spin the media and the politicians have put on the issues of the day. To get the correct spin on what's going on in North Carolina, let's introduce you to our panel of experts. They include former Lieutenant Governor Dennis Wicker, Syndicated columnist and author John Hood, NC Policy Watch's Chris Fitzsimon, and former House Speaker Joe Mavretic. We've got a most timely and interesting show for you this week, which begins with discussion about 4 proposed constitutional amendments. We'll also talk about some of the legislature our lawmakers are considering, and we'll ask our panel if we need to revisit the governance structure for our community colleges. And of course, as always, we'll get the panel to tell us something we don't know. Let's get started. 4 proposals before the General Assembly would ask voters to ratify our governing document. We want our panel to discuss the pros and cons of these proposed constitutional amendments. Joe Mavretic, there's a general understanding that one legislature cannot bind another or future legislatures, but this General Assembly wants to prevent future legislators from changing their ceiling on personal income taxes. What do you think of their amendment that would cap the personal income tax rate at 5.5%?
Well, I think that's part of the strategy to go to a general sales tax and reduce income taxes. But I think the real issue is much larger than that, Tom. What the Assembly ought to be doing is saying to the people of North Carolina, we're going to have a general review of the Constitution itself. I mean, think about how many items are out there. Succession, legislative session limits, what the superintendent of public instruction is really supposed to do, how do we get judges, about issuing debt notices that aren't general obligation bonds. It's on and
just
on and on.
Just about every generation we need to do this.
That's exactly right.
And we haven't done it since when?
Well, it's
been
about
25 years.
No, it's closer to, it's a little over 40, and we ought to do it at least 1971. So what we ought to do is every generation ought to have an input to the social contract call a state constitution.
Dennis, if this proposal was put before the voters as 5.5% personal income tax, is there any doubt in your mind it would pass?
Oh, none. I think it would pass, and I think it could have greater implications than what the speakers talked about, because then you're taking and you're shifting it to the sales tax, where lower, moderate income people have to pay more of their share of the tax.
Which we're already seeing. But John, there's currently a cap on personal income taxes in the Constitution.
Yes,
it's
there
10%.
Long been a cap. But
what's wrong with that? I mean, is there a problem?
It's irrelevant because it is so high. I mean, you know, Chris might jack it up to 10%, but nobody else is going to.
Well, they can always set it lower, and
that's what they're proposing to do.
But Chris, here's my question. What would happen when we have our next economic downturn, and certainly we're going to? We've run out of our reserves. We can't raise personal income taxes.
Well, we'd be in a mess. We'd have to dramatically increase sales taxes. We'd have to cut budgets. We'd have to lay people off if things got bad enough. I don't think there's anything wrong with being prudent and not raising taxes when we don't need to, but I also don't think we should be tying the hands of the next legislature or the next 10 years or the next 20 years. And who knows what our tax system will look like. The idea that if voters are unhappy with the tax rate, they can vote people out of office every 2 years and get people in there who will change the tax rate either way they want it to go. It's also a little absurd. You mentioned, will it pass? Why don't we just have a constitutional amendment that says we'll have no taxes? People would vote for that too, but there has to be some responsibility of governing.
Let's put a constitutional amendment in that says the voters of North Carolina are able to raise referendums and issues that they'd like to vote on. Dennis, back to another one of these proposed amendments. There's a recommendation that we amend the Constitution to elect State Board of Education members. Now, the way the proposal would work is that the governor appoints a chair who doesn't have a vote. We'd have the lieutenant governor. We would also have the superintendent of public instruction who would get a vote in this scenario. But the other 13 would be elected by the state congressional districts. What do you think of that?
Well, I think that I think it's a little dangerous in that I don't think voters would be able to tell a lot about how these races would shape up and whether or not they would be able to discern who these people are that are running. I mean, they have a hard enough time deciding who the Commissioner of Agriculture is and who the candidates are for Superintendent of Public Instruction, much less 13 different types of
and that would mean these guys would have to have election campaigns.
Well, I think we missed the whole point here about this board. The board is supposed to know something about education. So I think the first thing you have to say is, well, the folks who are on the State Board of Education ought to know about education. You don't have a board of physicians looking at medical issues and have somebody who knows about plumbing. So I think you have to also, what happens if we get 14 people, 14 representatives as our population grows? Then are you going to have to change the Constitution to now move it up to 14?
Well, and there's no guarantee that even with this 13, that these 13 people will know anything about education.
So
that's
here's
exactly
the thing
right.
About the population of boards of education is that across the country there are many different models. Some of them are just gubernatorial appointees. Some states don't even have state boards of education. Some of them elected the boards, just like what we're talking about. Some large states do that. It doesn't seem to make any difference at all in educational performance, and that should tell you something. We can debate all day long who does what, who appoints whom, should we elect. There does not seem to be any relationship between the mode in which we staff a state board, even if we have one, and educational outcomes.
That argues for not doing anything. And we don't need a gerrymandered State Board of Education.
Well, Dennis, my question is, we've already got this lawsuit that is working its way through the courts, which the legislature passed in December, taking authority away from the State Board of Education. Now we're setting up a new what's going to happen there?
Nothing. I think that's right. You know, I think what I'd rather see, rather than this kind of quote-unquote reform, Tom, is that I'd like to see us sort of consolidate the decision makers of education. I think Joe makes a good point. You got the legislature, you got the governor, you got the State Board of Education, you got the local boards of education, you got
the superintendent.
You got all these people in the mix. There's nobody accountable.
And
Well, what Dennis has said is something that was said 30 years ago. Who speaks for public education in North Carolina? The answer is nobody and everybody. So I don't think we're moving in the right direction. The other thing is that if we're going to talk about the state superintendent of public instruction from a constitutional point of view, then what we ought to be saying is, well, what are his or her duties?
Yes.
Let's spell them out clearly so there's no conflict between the board and the superintendent.
John, I want to move on to another proposed amendment, which it's called eminent domain, would restrict the taking of private land for public purposes. The legislature has been debating this now for at least 5 or 6 years. They hadn't even been able to pass legislation themselves. What makes us think that the public of North Carolina is astute enough to be able to vote on that?
Oh, I think the public would vote to protect property rights, and they should, and other states already have. We're really behind the curve here in not protecting people's property against eminent domain abuse. It is a real problem. It actually happens. There are whole books about abusive cases in other states and certainly cases in North Carolina that are troubling. The local governments push up against this all the time because they want the maximum ability to condemn land, even though they're not going to use it to build a school or use it for some other actual public use. They want to basically take land from people whose use of the land they don't like and transfer it to some other people they think will make more money on it. Now, whatever you think about that as a practical matter, that is wrong. It is not the purpose of government to steal property or even pay for it, take property forcibly and give it to somebody else because you think somebody else will use it better.
Chris, I have to ask you about this last proposed constitutional amendment, which was just proposed in the last few days. Four representatives would repeal Article 1, Section 4 of our Constitution, which forbids North Carolina from seceding from the U.S. government.
I thought that was an Onion headline when I read that. Yeah, I don't.
Is it serious? Is it going anywhere?
Well, those are two different questions. I think the people who introduced it might think it's serious. It's clearly not going anywhere, and it's one of those bills that everybody's going to talk about and nothing's going to happen.
Tom, before you leave this, our viewers ought to, if they have a chance to look at the state constitution, look at Article 1, Section 35, and see if that suggest to you out there in voter land that we ought to have review of the Constitution on a regular basis every 25 or 50 years.
Well, we thank you for watching NC Spin on the air or on YouTube. Here's a reminder there's much more on our website, ncspin.com, or NC Spin on Facebook. You'll find video footage not seen anywhere else, perspective pieces from our panel, and my weekly column. Get more balanced debate from the Old North State on ncspin.com, NC Spin on Facebook, or on Twitter at NC Spin Tweets. After these messages, we're going to talk about legislation being proposed.
NC Spin will return after these messages.
The slogan on our family farm is growing the next generation. It means using innovative technology to conserve water and increase yields. It embodies our passion for providing food and fiber for our neighbors near and far. It represents our desire to take care of our employees, our land, and to leave a better place for our children. Farm life isn't easy, but it's a good life, and I love what I do.
North Carolina is a great state with great assets.
Among them are 180,000 state employees.
Our legislators are considering important decisions regarding working conditions,
health insurance,
retirement benefits,
and pay for state employees.
Syndicated is the one voice at the table when those decisions are being considered.
Syndicated is revitalized and refocused.
A stronger Syndicated ensures a more effective voice.
Learn more at www.syndicated.org.
We now return to NC Spin.
The legislature's in full swing now, with a number of measures being introduced at both the House and the Senate. We want our panel to discuss and give their reactions to some of them. Chris, let's start with the proposal in the Senate that would have all bills go before the respective committees for consideration, but then would require they also be sent to the Senate Rules Committee. What does that mean, and is it necessary?
Well, you can look at this two ways, and I've heard people say both things. One is that it provides another safeguard and gives you more time to consider legislation. The other one is that it makes sure the leadership has a say and nothing goes to the floor without the leaders having a say on their. The Rules Committee is the most carefully appointed committee, the most powerful committee already in the legislative process. I'm all for more transparency. I'm all for more deliberate consideration of bills. If the Rules Committee is going to give these things a fair hearing, I don't think it's necessarily a bad idea. The real test will come, and Majority Leader Harry Brown raised this, is the last day or two of the session when they're literally having meetings around people's desks. Are they then going to have a Rules Committee meeting around somebody else's desk? I think we shouldn't allow meetings around desks, to tell you the truth, because the public can't participate.
John, Governor Cooper has on his desk the first legislation that was passed this session, a bill that would reduce the UNC Board of Governors from its 32-member current status to 28 immediately, and then 24 ultimately. What's your reaction to it?
Well, I think it's a good idea. I think the board is too large. We were talking in the previous segment about state-by-state comparisons, and this is a case where we really are a huge outlier. Most states have a more rational setup for governing state university systems. They have boards of 12 or boards of 16 or whatever, sometimes 8. 32, when you have a board of 32, what you actually have are a few leaders and lots of people in an audience. And that's different from having a real board. I think having a smaller board would be appropriate. Now, it doesn't have to go all the way down to 16, or some are ultimately proposing.
Joe, UNC President Margaret Spelling says she likes the idea of restricting the board, but there are a lot of people claiming that the purpose behind all of this is to get rid of some members that the legislature doesn't like.
Well, that may be, but I like the 32-member board, and I'll tell you why. You have 16 constituent universities. Every one of them ought to be represented on the board by a former chairman of the local board of trustees, and then you can have the other 16 members from any place you want, politically or otherwise. And until the smaller campuses get a voice on the board from somebody who knows what those smaller campuses need, we're going to continue to have this top-heavy system with Chapel Hill, State, and Greensboro at the top.
But the legislature would lose some control here. Dennis, another one of the bills is to allow judicial elections at the district court level, the superior court level. Every state judgeship would be listed as a partisan. You'd see the party, the Republican or Democrat, beside each name. It would also go down to local school board races and town council races. What do you think of this?
Well, there are just some things that I think shouldn't be partisan. For a long time it was partisan, and then they went, the State Bar wanted to go to the nonpartisan elections for judges, for example. And I think that, of course, Lady Justice is blind and should have no disposition one way or the other, quite frankly. And it's sort of frightening to think about a judge may be partisan in their judgment that they render in a case. We hope not. I like the nonpartisan part. I think education and education boards shouldn't be partisan. I don't see any way that that benefits children and learning. And town councils, I mean, come on, they work together in a community. I don't see the need for it, but some people would argue
what is
that's
the motivation for this?
Well, the motivation really is for people who are into sculpture, particularly working with bronze, because they want to take the mask off of Lady Justice.
Chris?
Tom, the reason is really very simple. When you have nonpartisan elections, voters rarely know who they're voting for. It's really that simple. Nonpartisan elections are less competitive, fewer people participate in them, they don't know who they're voting for. What happens in election years is Republican-leaning voters, Democrat-leaning voters start furiously asking around, now, who are the judges I'm supposed to vote for? They don't have R&D. And so both parties hand out guides. These are the R's, these are the... It is all a kabuki dance. The idea here is to take the mask off.
I was going to say, are they going to know anything more about them now?
They will at least know the party labels, which they currently don't know.
Chris, another piece of legislation would withhold state funding from all so-called sanctuary cities, the cities that refuse to enforce immigration laws. What do you think of that?
Well, we passed a bill last session that forbids sanctuary cities. The big debate in the legislature, first of all, I don't like this idea, but the second part of that is, what is a sanctuary city? Is a police department who has a policy that says if we pull somebody over for a broken taillight, we're not going to ask their immigration status, we're only going to do it with violent crimes? Some legislators would say that's protecting illegal immigrants.
All right,
So
I got to get to this topic, the last question here. Governor Cooper and Attorney General Stein this past week announced that they were essentially going to drop the lawsuit on voting rights. And legislative leaders said, wait a minute, they didn't hire these lawyers that are advocating for it. How can they drop it? Comment on it quickly.
I think their argument is pretty straightforward. The legislative leaders, under a statute that was duly enacted, have the authority to hire attorneys to represent the state, not just legislative leaders. Those attorneys have been representing the state for years. Cooper didn't hire them. He can't fire them.
Anybody disagree with that position?
Yeah, there's going to be a lawsuit on top of a lawsuit.
That's right. And I think there's some question about how
a lawsuit spawning a lawsuit.
There is some dispute about how they were hired and whether they were hired legally. You might argue that they were, but that's going to be where the lawsuit is decided.
We remember on a previous show we said what's going to happen for 4 years is they pass a bill, it gets vetoed, and it comes back, it's overridden. The governor and the AG take it to court. We're going to see 4 years of the governor and the AG going to court.
Right. That is right. And in this case, this is actually a panic button push. They fear that this is going to go to the U.S. Supreme Court and the circuit court is going to be overturned, and they're trying to stop that from happening.
After these messages, we're going to talk about community college governance.
NC Spin will return after these messages.
The healthcare landscape is filled with questions and uncertainties of changes that are coming. In these times of change, there's one thing you can trust. You can trust your family physician to work for you, not only in treating sickness and disease, but also your overall health. Regardless of how healthcare might change, the men and women of the North Carolina Academy of Family Physicians pledge to work upholding your trust. Family Physicians, your trusted healthcare advisors.
You sleep on concrete till your body get immune to concrete.
My mom got my brother and I up and said, come on, we're leaving.
I became homeless in the beginning of this year.
When I was about 4 or 5 years old, our house caught fire.
I used to see my brother. If he see me, he'd turn and go the other direction.
We did the only thing that we could think of, and we went to a Salvation Army shelter.
You know, we don't have this, like, what's your background look like? We just say, what do you need?
I remember the man from the Salvation Army coming down with a box of clothes.
The Salvation Army officer bought my brother and I an ice cream cone.
Last week, my brother walked up to me, and he just started a conversation.
Today I've given my life to the Salvation Army because I remember what somebody did for me, my brother, and my mom over 30 years ago.
The Salvation Army for me means hope.
Compassion.
Family.
Support.
We now return to NC Spin.
When North Carolina created community colleges, it set up a governance system far different from that of either our public universities or K-12 public education system. Our leaders wanted to vest as much power as possible in the hands of local boards of the 58 colleges and limit the amount of power the state president and the state board had. Dennis Wicker, some are suggesting we need to revisit this governance structure. You served as board chair of the state community colleges. What's your take on changing governance?
Well, Tom, you know, you served in the stead of the state treasurer, Harlan Boyles, when you were deputy treasurer. Let me tell you, you ever remember your father telling you, son, never poke at a hornet's nest?
Yeah.
I think that's about what we're looking at here. We have a pretty good system as it is. The state board and the president sets policy. But these community colleges have really thrived because of local governments. They take pride there. Every one of your community leaders, all your civic leaders are board members. They run a clean shop and they educate our people to become, the technicians of the future. And here we are wanting to consolidate and take that away from the local level and consolidate it and give it to Raleigh. Don't ever poke a hornet's nest.
But Joe, there are several instances, some of them fairly glaring instances, where these local boards have not, in fact, overseen their colleges as much as they should, and instead defer entirely almost to the local presidents. Does that warrant a change?
Well,
or how do we get the boards to do that?
What I would do, a quick fix, I would have the lieutenant governor become the chairman of the State Board of Education, keep him the chairman of the Community College Board, and make him the chairman of the University Board of Governors, and that way you would see if the lieutenant governor has the capability to be an education governor the next time around.
But how does that fix the governance problems at some of these local colleges?
Well, I mean, if there's governance problems at individual colleges, the colleges have to fix that. The appointments have to fix it. It's interesting the General Assembly tried to take some appointive powers to community college boards away from the governor. I mean, the people who appoint the boards are ultimately responsible for the boards. If we have one or two that have problems, I'm not sure we need to change the hornet's nest.
I think the obvious answer is partisan elections for community college board.
Got to find out whether they're Republicans or Democrats.
Absolutely.
Yeah, okay, I just pushed the button and that's your standard answer. Is that it? After these messages, we're going to ask the panel to tell us something we don't know.
NC Spin is brought to you in part by the North Carolina Farm Bureau. The Farm Bureau and Agriculture. We keep North Carolina growing.
The cost of everything has gone up dramatically over the last 75 years. With one exception, keeping electricity affordable. That's the power of your co-op membership. Learn more at togetherwesave.com.
North Carolina's Touchstone Energy Cooperatives, looking out for you.
North Carolina is a great state with great assets.
Among them are 180,000 state employees.
Our legislators are considering important decisions regarding working conditions,
health insurance,
retirement benefits,
and pay for state employees.
Scenic is the one voice at the table when those decisions are being considered.
Scenic is revitalized and refocused.
A stronger Scenic ensures a more effective voice.
Learn more at www.scenic.org.
We now return to NC Spin.
Now we come to one of the favorite parts of the show, or at least the one you talk to me about the most. That's when we ask the panel to tell us something we don't know. They get to choose the topic and sound off for a few seconds. Chris Fitzsimon, I'll start with you.
Well, we've talked on this show a lot about the protests that are happening around the country on the progressive side this time instead of the Tea Party side as in 2009. I actually think the mood of the country is changing. I don't know whether it's the president or what is happening. In North Carolina, there have been 3 major polling firms. High Point University did a poll. Public Policy Polling did a poll. Civitas did a poll. All 3 of them showed Roy Cooper significantly in 2 or 3 of the polls, more popular than Donald Trump. And maybe the most surprising in the Civitas poll, and folks who don't know, Civitas is a very conservative polling outfit. They ask about the Affordable Care Act. In North Carolina, 46% of the people don't like the way the Affordable Care Act is working for them. 46% of the people do like the way the Affordable Care Act is working for them. I thought that was fascinating. In a conservative organization's poll, we're told everybody hates the Affordable Care Act. We got to get rid of it. Even in North Carolina, it's 50-50 about what people think of it.
I think that what's going on in Congress right now and what some of these congressmen and senators are finding in their town hall meetings would verify what you're saying. Joe Mavretic, tell us something we don't know.
A few days ago, there was a meeting in Morehead City about shrimping. And the end result was that the shrimping in North Carolina ought to take place 3 days a week, 3 miles or further offshore, and during the day. The discussion went against the recommendations of scientists who understand and look at this problem. So I spent the last weekend down in the little town of Atlantic, down east, listening to shrimpers.
Commercial shrimpers.
Commercial shrimpers. And what's going to happen if North Carolina loses shrimping in our sounds is that we're going to see unintended consequences of great magnitude for people who have been good, loyal, hard-working North Carolinians for 4 or 5 or 6 generations. And we'll all be eating shrimp from off.
China. Yeah, no question about it. Now, there are other sides of that story about overfishing and over shrimping some of these sounds.
Well, yeah, I know. There are a lot of people out there who are really concerned about how many spot they caught last week.
Or being able to catch a spot. Dennis, tell us something we don't know.
You know, Tom, there's a lot made over the governor's veto. If he vetoes something, now the legislature has a supermajority and they can't override the governor's veto. So they override the governor's veto. It's a lot of drama, a lot of people talking about how that happened and who voted how. But there are some instances where the governor doesn't have the veto power at all. Doesn't have the veto power on redistricting bills, on constitutional amendments, or on local bills. And so it doesn't matter whether they have a supermajority or not. The governor has no say in those bills whatsoever. And we just got through talking about the importance of these constitutional amendments. The governor has no play.
Yeah, at all?
At all.
All right. John Hood, tell us something we don't know.
Tom, the latest data on gross domestic product just came out from the federal government about the states. North Carolina has the 10th fastest growing state in the third quarter of 2016 and actually over the last 12 months. First in the South in growth in the third quarter. This is just another indicator that North Carolina's economy continues its momentum. It's doing better than the national average, better than the regional average. Now, it's not going to protect us if the American economy goes in a different direction, but right now, as the legislature is forming its budget, thinking about the next 2 years, North Carolina continues to outperform the average.
Wow. Well, you've heard our spin on the issues of the day. To stay informed all during the week, give your feedback, and read my weekly column. Visit our website, ncspin.com, or catch NC Spin on Facebook. And join us next week when we'll have more balanced debate for the Old North State. Until then, stay informed and watch out for the spin.
Join us next week and get the spin on issues facing our state.